bring it up? Okay. I depend on you, John. I appreciate what John does. He helps us a lot. Let's go ahead and get started. I hope you have the outlines on the book of Hebrews. We're going to be studying that this quarter. And before we actually get into the thoughts for this morning, we want to go to the Lord in prayer and certainly ask Him to bless us and help us in our study of this book. I really believe that when you're going to try to do the Lord's work, you certainly need His help to do it. Not a better way to get it than to ask for it. So we're going to go to the Lord in prayer and ask Him to be with us and to help us in our efforts today. And Eddie, if you would direct our minds, please. Let me encourage you to also, in your prayers, to keep those who've lost loved ones in your thoughts, those who struggled over the weekend because of, or the holidays because of the loss of loved ones. But also pray for peace, because since the first of the year, we have had 7 distinct terrorist attacks in the U.S. And so things are beginning to wrap up as far as that type thing. And I believe that could get worse as the year or the inauguration comes closer. In fact, they have Redstone Arsenal now on high alert. So just keep all that in your prayers, and hopefully and prayerfully that things will transition peacefully, and we can have a better outlook on our nation than we have had in the past few years. And so in our study of the book of Hebrews, I will tell you that I'm not going to go verse by verse. We have 1 quarter to cover the book of Hebrews. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the superiority of Christ, and we're going to look at the superiority of His priesthood, the superiority of His covenant, the superiority of His promises, and a variety of things like that. And that way we can hopefully cover the book of Hebrews and have a good grasp of what the book is really all about. We will cover a lot of verses in Hebrews, in fact, most of them, I guess, but we're not going to go verse by verse like I would want to do. And so we're going to do what we can to finish the book within the quarter. And I do want to begin by pointing out some things. As far as the book is concerned, the authorship of it, we really don't know. Now, I do have my opinions, and please understand that that's all it is my opinion as to who wrote the book. And, but as far as me being dogmatic or me saying, okay, this is the one that wrote it and there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it, I can't do that because I honestly don't know. As far as the authorship of the book, though, there is evidence. There have been suggestions that maybe that Paul's the one that wrote the book, who would have been well qualified to do that, being brought up at the feet of Gamaliel and taught according to the perfect manner of the law. Others suggest that Barnabas may have written it. Barnabas was well equipped to have written it. And some have even suggested that perhaps Luke had interpreted it, but Luke was a Gentile and wouldn't have been near as familiar with the material in the book as someone else. Eusebius, who lived from 260 AD up to about 340 AD, he's one that has suggested that Clement of Alexandria, which lived from about 150 up to about 215 AD, that close to the first century, said that Paul wrote the book. He held that he wrote it, and that Luke translated it. However, some have suggested that Paul said that he signed his books with his own handwriting or his own hand, which is not necessarily the case, but nevertheless, that argument's been made. And also the very fact that it's often, there are similarities between Paul and the book of Hebrews. Some of those similarities, like for example, in Hebrews 1 verse 4 is very close to what Paul wrote in Philippians 2:9. What you read in Hebrews 2:2 is very close to what Paul wrote in Galatians 3:19. And Hebrews 2:10 is very familiar or very close to Romans 11:30. And so Hebrews 7:18, very close to what's written in Romans 8:13. So you've got a lot of similarities between Paul and what is written in the book of Hebrews. But there were others, such as the fathers, that did not agree that Paul wrote the book. And so you've got Ananias, and he included Hebrews in the 14 epistles of Paul. And but there's also those such as Irenaeus and Hippolus that denied that Paul did write it. So as Origen said, only God himself knows who actually penned the book. Now, when people say, well, Paul usually penned, or he usually used his name when he was writing a letter, and therefore it's proof that Paul didn't write Hebrews, I'm not sure in my own mind that is a legitimate consideration. I tell you why. There's no one that hated Paul any more than the Jews did. And when it came to the rejection of Paul, they sought to kill him. They had really no use for Paul because of his turning away from the Jewish faith and adopting Christianity. And so if Paul was going to address some issues that was confronting these Christians, probably he would write the letter in an anonymous way to where that they would accept it and not reject it at the outset because of who wrote it. And so I'm not convinced that that type of argument against Paul will necessarily hold water. And so as far as I'm concerned, I have my opinion. That's all it is. And so I would encourage you to read material that's put out by Guthrie on the introduction of the New Testament. You can also find some material in a book on the introduction of the New Testament by Tenney. You can find some that discusses in detail in the introduction of the Bible by Thiessen. And so you can also use International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, McClintock & Strong's Encyclopedia, and gather a lot more information in regard to the authorship and the pros and cons as to which one wrote the book. So I'll leave that to your discretion. As far as the actual date of the book, some have suggested it was written somewhere around 60. Some have suggested it's written a little bit later. But what we do know is that it was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, because it appears the temple is still standing, that the law has not been completely rendered inoperative. The Jews still could trace their descendants. The Jews still offered their animal sacrifices. They still observed the law in a rigorous fashion. So it indicates that it was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. It is, however, the book of Hebrews is dealing with a problem. It's a problem that these Christians are facing. And the problem is they're on the verge of leaving the Lord. They're struggling with their faith. So he's dealing with a problem that's not much different than what we deal with today. Maybe different circumstances and maybe a little different situations that's put them to the test. But nevertheless, they are really struggling with their faith, and they're on the verge of giving up on Christ. And that's why that the statement is made in Hebrews 3:12 when he said, "Take heed, brethren, lest there develop in you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God." So what Paul does in that statement is he takes the departure from God as being because of an evil heart that has brought about a state of unbelief. It's not an unbelief in God, it is an unbelief in the accomplishments of Christ. And so when you begin to think about what's going on in this book, they're really struggling with their faith. They're on the verge of going back and reverting back into Judaism. And it's quite interesting too, when you would say, well, why in the world would they do such a thing? Well, stop and think. People are more inclined by what they see rather than what they might believe. And so here, these people are being called upon to believe in a Christ they can no longer see, a system that they cannot see or feel, and it's a system of faith. Well, here they are being pressured, even persecuted. When you look in Hebrews 11 and the latter part of the chapter, you begin to see just how severe that persecution was. So look at Hebrews 11, and let's just look at something a statement he makes in regard to what some of these Christians were having to deal with. Let's pick up with about verse 36, because in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 36, he says, Others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. Well, you stop and you think about, why would he write that? Because he's trying to get these brethren to understand they're not the only ones that's gone through some things. And they need to keep their faith in Christ and not be so quick to give up. Hebrews 10 talks about their trials, and we will address that in just a little bit. So rather than isolating on the specific problem, what he does, he offers legitimate reasons as to why they ought to stay faithful to Christ. Now, keep in mind that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. That's what these Christians, it's a walk by faith. And these people have been converted to Christ. They've been walking by faith. They are undergoing hardship and persecution. They're undergoing extreme peer pressure. They can't see what they're being persecuted for. But here they are, the very people that's persecuting them, the Jews, they can still see the animal sacrifices offered. They can still read the law. They can still observe Judaism. And so being rooted in Judaism and coming out of it and undergoing what they're undergoing in regard to things they can't even see, they're now looking out and say, well, here's a religion I can observe. I can see it. And so they're inclined to revert back. And it's just like if you were to take people today where that a person is converted out of the world and he is expected to walk by faith. And so he becomes a Christian. He realizes what the Lord has done. He is baptized for the remission of his sin. And for a while, he's faithful. But then his old friends keep hammering him, kept pestering him, and just keeps on trying to drag him back. And finally, he turns his attention back to the world, and he sees what he had, that he could see, his friends that he had, the fun that he had, all those type things, and it's easy for him to go back. And so what Paul does, he said, I'm not going to isolate on your problem. That's pretty simple to identify. You're about to depart from Christ. So what he does, he says, now I'm going to give you some reasons why you ought not do it. And that's what he tries to do in the book of Hebrews. And so what they faced is not much different than what we face today. And that's why that I wanted to study the book of Hebrews, because I believe that its relevance and it being so pertinent to the very things that we can encounter and we struggle with even among ourselves. So there's some facts in the book I want you to pay attention to. Number one is the fact that we can know some things about those who had the problem. And as far as knowing some things about them, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, there is a reference to the fathers. Now notice by implication, we can conclude that they were of a Jewish background. And somebody said, well, why would you say that? Well, one of the main reasons is this, that the Gentiles would have had no interest or even concern about what the book of Hebrews is addressing. That would have been more in line with the Jewish audience. The other thing is that in Hebrews 1 verse 1, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets. Gentiles wouldn't have been concerned about the fathers or the prophets, but Jewish audience would. The reference to Moses in Hebrews 3 verse 2, who received the law, which was specifically for the Jew in Deuteronomy 5, the Gentile would have had no interest in Moses. They wouldn't have cared about Moses. Moses would have been important, though, to the Jew. And so when you look, for example, the reference to Jesus coming out of the tribe of Judah, what would the Gentiles have been concerned about that for? Why would that have been the case? Because, well, what does that mean? It was written to the Jews because the Jews knew that Jesus, if he was going to be a priest, would have to come out of the tribe of Levi. And whoever wrote Hebrews is writing them and saying, look, Jesus is going to be an entirely different priesthood. He's going to come out of the tribe of Judah. He's going to be after the order of Melchizedek, and there's going to be no end to his reign as a high priest. Well, the Gentiles could have cared less about a high priest. It didn't mean anything to a Gentile unless he was converted to Christ. And so when you think about that, well, you take even further the reference to Jesus coming out of Judah and reference to his priesthood in Hebrews 7:15. The heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. What impact would that have had to a Gentile? And so what he's trying his best to do is appeal to an audience that is of Jewish background, that have been converted to Christ, and they're about to revert back to their old system. And he's trying to get them to stabilize in Christ. And so you also have the idea they were very familiar with the law of Moses. They were very familiar with the rituals and the customs and of the Jews. And you can see that. You can read the book of Leviticus, and it will give you a lot of insight into the book of Hebrews, quite a bit. And so they had heard the gospel, they had obeyed it, Hebrews 2:1-3. They were to give careful attention to it, lest they would lose it. And they were identified as holy brethren. Now, this is something that's interesting to me, and that is that these people were on the verge of reverting back to Judaism, but the author still considers them as holy brethren. In other words, he recognizes their faults and their failures and their inclinations to revert back. But he said, you're still holy brethren. What does that indicate? They had sincerely obeyed the gospel. They had been faithful for a while, but they're on the verge of losing their faith now in Christ and reverting back. And so he tries to establish this relationship. You are to me brethren. And since you belong to Christ, you're holy. So you're holy brethren, but you need to be stabilized. You need to mature. You need to grow. And so they had been Christians for some time, in fact. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12, when for the time you ought to be teachers, then you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principle of the oracles of God. So they ought to have been mature enough already to be teachers, but they were not. They were still somewhat immature. They're called the house of God in Hebrews 3, verse 6, over which Jesus is high priest in Hebrews 10:21. And so Paul is identifying them, establishing a relationship with them, letting them know what kind of relationship they share together, and then also consider the fact that they had been active in the gospel of Christ, Hebrews 6, verse 10. They had joyfully suffered at one point, according to Hebrews 10:32-34. And I want to read you this because I want you to be aware that they were undergoing some hardships, some difficulties as far as the testing of their faith. Because in 32 he says, but call to remembrance the former days in which after that ye were illuminated, that is, you became Christians, you were enlightened, you endured a great flight of affliction. So what does it mean? It means that they had undergone some persecution. They had undergone some hardships. And so we know that much about them. We also know that they were members of a congregation with elders in it. And you know that from Hebrews 13:17, obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves. For they watch for your souls, that may do it with joy and not with grief, for that's unprofitable to you. Or Hebrews 13:7, where they would respect those and follow the lead of those elders, considering the end of their conversation. And so they were members of a congregation that had an eldership within it. We also realize that there was an assembly that some of them now, because of the weakness of their faith, they were forsaking or abandoning. And you find that in Hebrews 10, verse 25, because the word forsaking comes from a word which means to abandon, desert, or leave in straits, or to leave helpless. And so the idea is these Christians were not coming together as God intended in a corporate assembly. And we have even that problem today, do we not? We have that very same problem even today. And without riding a hobby horse or without going too deep into it, the COVID problem that came up a few years ago, in which people began to stay at home and they were told to stay at home and virtually worship, were made to believe that virtual worship was as acceptable as corporate worship. And then after they began to stay at home, even after it was all over because of convenience and whatever the reason, then preachers and elders began to become very concerned, and rightfully so, as to why they wouldn't return to the corporate setting when they'd already been told that virtual was just as good. And so we have done an irreparable harm among brethren because of that. And so the problem even exists today. I was talking to a friend of mine in Mississippi, and many of you know him. And he called me and he said, Bill, what are we going to do? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I mean about getting people back together to worship. I said, I don't know. I said, it's developed like I was afraid it would. There'd be a precedent set in which we would become infatuated with trying to stay at home and worship by TV or worship by computer. And he said, well, let me tell you what we've got. He said, we've got people now that will come in on Saturday, pick up their communion supplies. They will go back home and then never come back to worship. And I've asked them why, and they said that it was more convenient. They didn't have to get ready to go to church, and they could hear a little bit better over the internet. And so they decided they just would not come back to worship. And somebody said, well, why in the world would they think that? Because they were convinced that virtual worship was just as acceptable as corporate worship. And then we have to unteach one to try to teach the other as far as the importance of brethren coming together, because people doesn't seem to realize that there are things that you get in a corporate setting you cannot get in a virtual setting. And God never intended virtual to be the avenue of worship, and otherwise he would not have stressed so much coming together. But be that as it may, it is what it is. And so there were those who were not assembly, because of their weakening of their faith. And that's what it really shows, is a weak faith. Well, the second thing is this, that the problem the author is dealing with, and we've already touched this, is the danger of apostasy. The danger of apostasy. And when you think about that, I have listed a great number of verses that points out to you there is no doubt what the problem among these brethren are and what has brought it about. If we don't get through all of this morning, we will pick it up next week. But I'm really wanting to drive home the fact of the type people we're dealing with, what has generated this problem, and then to pinpoint what the problem really is. The problem is them giving up on Christ. And so, how many people do you know, today, that were former members at East Huntsville who have given up on their faith? You stop and you think about it. It is. Yeah. What Mark's saying is that it's a brotherhood problem, and he's right. It is a brotherhood problem. We have declined. Well, all religious groups have declined, but the church is no exception. It's declined. There's an attrition rate. And by that, I simply mean a falling out of the race. And so I've often addressed Peggy. I've talked to her. I said, it's so discouraging when you have to try to spend more time in keeping your brethren faithful than you do in going out and trying to reach a world that is dying, lost in sin. That's what's discouraging, disheartening. That people that ought to be helping you reach the world, you're having to spend time trying to encourage them, don't give up. Don't give up. And I'm sure Paul felt the very same way. Yeah. It is. It is a heart problem. There's no doubt about that. The only thing I was emphasizing was that it has helped enhance that type mindset. And it's a sad thing. Sad thing. And, there's people, I remember when I was preaching at Lois that I'd preached on attendance one Sunday. And a fellow came up, a very supposedly grounded member of the church, I thought, that came up to the house and knocked on the door. And he said, I want to talk to you about church attendance. I said, okay. He said, now, I attend on Sunday morning. I attend on Sunday night. He said, but nowhere does the Bible tell me to attend Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I said, well, that's right. I said, but the problem is not what the Bible is telling you. The problem is the attitude you got toward worship. Because a Christian who really believes that God has saved him through Christ and that the church is his family and brotherhood can't be around them too much. You understand what I'm saying? It's just like my mother and my father and my daughter and my family. I can't be around them too much. It means something to me when we're together. Yesterday meant a lot to me because we were together. And so when a Christian's attitude is what it ought to be, and I think, Mark, you agree with that. When a Christian's attitude is what it ought to be, he looks forward to every opportunity he can get together and worship with his family, because that's where he gets the encouragement. That's where he gets the strength to go on. That's where he realizes you're not alone in all this suffering and hardship. That's where you get what you need. And that's the very design of it. Yes. And so what we'll do, if God permits that we live long enough to do so, that we will go into the problem they were dealing with. With your outline, you'll see that I want to deal with the problem, the causes, and also the solution. And then we will start breaking down the book of Hebrews, and we'll begin by pointing out the superiority of Jesus in the very first chapter of the book. Do any of you have any comments or any questions? Anything you want to say? Yes. We'll come back to that outline. Yeah. Point 2, Mark. It is. It is. And that's an interesting observation. People get disheartened because of false teachers. They get disheartened because of hardships. They get disheartened because of things like that. And yet what it proves is the inspiration of the scriptures, because they told us about every bit of that. So instead of weakening our faith, it ought to strengthen our faith, because of the fact that it told us all this, and it's coming, it shows up in our lives, and we can say the Lord knew what he's talking about the whole time. So anyway, I appreciate it very much.